An FBI agent was arrested for investigating police corruption, but that was exactly his job. What happened next would forever change how we view power, prejudice, and justice in America. Every small town holds its secrets, and this one was no different. Beneath the surface of friendly smiles and familiar faces, whispers traveled through quiet streets, carrying stories that nobody dared to speak aloud. The local police department had become the center of these whispers, tales of corruption, abuse of power, and betrayal of public trust. The atmosphere in the small-town police station buzzed with an unusual energy that morning. Federal investigators were rumored to be in town, though no one knew their identities or whereabouts. Every unfamiliar face became a potential threat, every casual conversation a possible trap. Officers moved through the building with cautious steps, their conversations hushed, their glances wary. The department was under a federal microscope, and everyone felt the weight of that scrutiny. For months, complaints had been piling up, allegations of racial profiling, excessive force, and systematic corruption. The evidence was there, buried in paperwork and hidden behind badges, but proving it required something more. It needed someone on the inside, someone who could experience it firsthand. That's where Miguel Santos came in. A Filipino-American FBI agent with years of undercover experience, Miguel had dismantled criminal organizations across the country. His strength lay not in force, but in observation, the ability to blend in, to become invisible while seeing everything. Today, as he approached the station, his casual clothes and relaxed demeanor masked a sharp mind trained to notice what others missed. The investigation was in its final phase. Miguel had already gathered substantial evidence, documenting patterns of misconduct that would shake the department to its core. His visit to the station today was meant to be routine, one last observation to confirm what he already knew. But fate had other plans. Officer Karen Blake sat at her desk, 20 years of experience having honed what she called her sixth sense for trouble. She'd built a reputation for being defensive and quick to judge, especially when it came to outsiders. Her sharp eyes zeroed in on Miguel the moment he stepped through the door. Something about his presence, perhaps his quiet confidence or his unfamiliar face, set her on edge. The station's usual morning bustle seemed to fade into the background as Karen watched Miguel move through the space. His calm demeanor, rather than putting her at ease, only heightened her suspicion. In her mind, people who had nothing to hide didn't act so composed. What happened next would spark a chain of events that no one could have predicted. A simple question about why he was there. A professional but firm refusal to explain himself. A confrontation that would expose exactly why this department needed federal oversight in the first place. The situation escalated quickly. Karen's demands for identification grew louder, drawing attention from other officers. Miguel maintained his composure, fully aware that every word, every reaction was proving the very points his investigation aimed to address. But when Karen reached for her handcuffs, the incident transformed from a mere confrontation into something far more significant. The irony was lost on no one who would later learn the truth. An FBI agent investigating police corruption was being arrested by the very department he was investigating. But in that moment, as the cold metal closed around his wrists, Miguel remained silent, his calm exterior masking the knowledge that this moment would become the cornerstone of his case. This was more than just a case of mistaken identity or abuse of power. It was about to become a turning point, not just for this small-town police department, but for law enforcement across the nation. A moment when prejudice, power, and justice would collide in a way that would force everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about the system they served. The story that unfolded from this point would challenge everything people thought they knew about authority, accountability, and change. It would prove that sometimes the most powerful catalyst for transformation comes not from grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but from quiet moments of dignity in the face of injustice. The interrogation room was deliberately designed to be uncomfortable. Its stark walls and harsh fluorescent lighting had witnessed countless confessions, but today they would witness something entirely different. Miguel Santos sat calmly in the metal chair, his handcuffed wrists resting on the cold table, while Officer Karen Blake's confidence began to show its first cracks. The room's silence was heavy with tension as Karen arranged her notepad, her movements betraying a growing uncertainty. She had made arrests before, hundreds of them, but something about this one felt different. The suspect's composure was unsettling. Most people in handcuffs showed fear, anger, or at least anxiety. This man showed nothing but patient resignation, as if he was merely waiting for something inevitable. "Name," Karen demanded, her voice sharp with authority. Miguel remained silent, his steady gaze fixed on her. The silence stretched between them, becoming almost tangible. Karen's irritation grew with each passing second. She had dealt with difficult suspects before, but this quiet defiance was something new. It challenged her authority in a way that loud protests never could. "You're not helping yourself," she pressed, leaning forward. "Give me your name or I'll add obstruction of justice to your charges." The threat hung in the air, but Miguel's expression didn't change. His silence was not just resistance, it was strategy. Every moment in this room was building evidence for his investigation, proving points he had suspected but needed to document. Outside the interrogation room, word of the mysterious arrest spread through the station. Officers gathered in small groups, their whispered conversations a mix of curiosity and concern. Something about this situation felt wrong, but no one could quite put their finger on why. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface for months seemed to be reaching a boiling point. Captain Howard was in his office when the reports reached him. A mysterious man, refusing to identify himself, arrested for trespassing in the station. The details sparked something in his memory, a memo he had received weeks ago, one he had filed away but never forgotten. His face darkened as the pieces began to fall into place. Back in the interrogation room, Karen's frustration was mounting. Her usual tactics weren't working. Threats, intimidation, appeals to cooperation. Nothing seemed to affect this man. His silence was more than just defiance. It felt like judgment. With each passing minute, her certainty about the arrest began to crumble. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you're in?" she asked, trying to maintain control of the situation. Miguel finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. "I think you should consider that question carefully, Officer Blake." The use of her name, which she hadn't given him, sent a chill down her spine. The door burst open before she could respond. Captain Howard stood in the doorway, his face a mask of contained fury and dawning horror. The sight of Miguel in handcuffs confirmed his worst fears. "Release him," Howard ordered, his voice cutting through the tension. "Release him now." Karen blinked, confusion evident on her face. "Sir? This man was trespassing, refusing to identify himself." "Agent Santos," Howard interrupted, addressing Miguel directly. "I cannot begin to apologize for this incident." The word seemed inadequate for what had transpired. Karen's face drained of color as understanding dawned. The silence that had felt like defiance now felt like judgment. As Howard personally removed the handcuffs, the full weight of what had happened began to settle over the room. The FBI agent investigating their department for corruption and racial bias had just experienced both firsthand. The very behaviors they had denied existed had been displayed, documented, and would now become evidence. Miguel stood, rubbing his wrists where the handcuffs had been. His silence now carried a different quality, not of resistance, but of authority. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. Karen stood frozen, her world tilting on its axis as she realized what she had done. This wasn't just a mistake. This was confirmation of everything their department had been accused of. The story was about to explode beyond the walls of this small-town police station. What happened in that interrogation room would become a catalyst for change, not just in this department, but in police departments across the country. Sometimes the most powerful evidence isn't what you find. It's what finds you. News travels fast in a small town, but truth travels faster in the digital age. Within hours of Miguel Santos's release, the story began to spread like wildfire through the community. Security camera footage from the station found its way onto social media, igniting a firestorm of reactions. The images were clear, a calm, professional man of color being handcuffed and detained for nothing more than his presence in a public building. The station's atmosphere had transformed completely. Officers who had witnessed the incident moved through the halls with downcast eyes, their earlier suspicion replaced by a heavy sense of shame. Karen Blake had been placed on immediate administrative leave, but her absence only emphasized the larger issues at play. This wasn't just about one officer's prejudice. It was about a system that had allowed such behavior to become normalized. Captain Howard spent the afternoon in crisis meetings, his phone ringing constantly with calls from the mayor's office, local media, and increasingly national news organizations. The irony was bitter. In trying to protect themselves from federal scrutiny, they had provided the perfect example of why that scrutiny was necessary. Meanwhile, Miguel Santos sat in his temporary office at the local FBI field headquarters, methodically typing his report. The incident would become far more than a single chapter in his investigation. It was now the cornerstone of a case that would reshape law enforcement policies across the country. His carefully maintained composure during the arrest had been more than professional dignity. It had been strategic brilliance. "Your restraint was remarkable," his supervisor commented, reviewing the footage. "Most agents would have identified themselves immediately." Miguel looked up from his computer. "Sometimes the best evidence is what people do when they think no one's watching," he replied. "We've been investigating complaints of racial profiling and abuse of power for months. Today, they provided us with irrefutable proof." The story continued to grow. Civil rights organizations issued statements, community leaders demanded action, and social media exploded with discussions about police reform. The security footage played on loop on national news channels, each viewing adding fuel to a debate that had been simmering for years. Local residents began sharing their own stories, previously untold experiences of discrimination and harassment at the hands of the department. What had started as a single incident was quickly revealing a pattern of behavior that could no longer be ignored or explained away. Karen Blake, isolated in her home, watched her career and beliefs crumble around her. The certainty she had felt in that moment, the instinct she had trusted for 20 years, now seemed like a damning indictment of everything she thought she knew. Her actions hadn't protected anyone. They had only exposed the prejudices she hadn't even realized she carried. The mayor called an emergency press conference, promising immediate action and reform. But for many, these words rang hollow. The community wanted more than promises. They demanded fundamental change. Protest gatherings began forming in the town square. Peaceful but determined, their messages clear. This time, business as usual would not be enough. Back at the station, officers gathered in small groups, their conversations different now. Some defended the old ways, claiming that caution and suspicion were necessary parts of the job. Others, especially younger officers, saw this as a moment of necessary transformation. The generational divide became apparent as debates about training, bias, and the role of law enforcement in modern society echoed through the halls. Miguel's investigation expanded beyond its original scope. The incident had cracked open a door that couldn't be closed again. Other departments across the state began receiving similar scrutiny as the ripple effects of that single arrest spread outward. What had started as a routine corruption investigation had become a catalyst for national change. The story was no longer just about one agent, one officer, or one department. It had become a mirror, reflecting uncomfortable truths about power, prejudice, and the possibility of transformation. Sometimes, the most significant changes begin not with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but with a single moment of quiet dignity in the face of injustice. 3 months after the incident that shook the small-town police department, the changes were more than cosmetic. Miguel Santos stood at a podium in the department's newly renovated community room, addressing a mixed audience of officers, community leaders, and media representatives. The final report of his investigation had become more than just a document. It had become a blueprint for transformation. "What happened that day was a symptom," Miguel began, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had marked his silence months ago. "But symptoms can lead us to cures if we're willing to look honestly at their causes." The room was packed, but you could hear a pin drop as he spoke. Many of the officers who had once viewed him with suspicion now sat attentively, their expressions thoughtful rather than defensive. The investigation had uncovered more than just individual instances of misconduct. It had revealed systemic issues that ran deep, informal policies that encouraged racial profiling, training procedures that emphasized force over communication, and a culture of silence that protected wrongdoing. But unlike many similar investigations, this one had produced real change. The department had undergone a complete overhaul. But more importantly, the department had embraced a new approach to law enforcement, one that emphasized community engagement, accountability, and transparency. Karen Blake, who had become the unintended symbol of the old system, had chosen a surprising path. After her initial suspension, she had done something unexpected. She had asked to meet with Miguel. That meeting, which lasted several hours, became another turning point in the story. "I thought I was protecting my community," she told him during their conversation, "but I was actually betraying everything I swore to protect." Instead of retiring or resigning in disgrace, Karen had become an advocate for change. She now traveled to other departments, sharing her story as a cautionary tale and a call to action. The ripple effects continued to spread. Other police departments across the country began implementing what became known as the Santos Protocol, a comprehensive approach to addressing systemic bias and corruption. The protocol wasn't just about new rules and procedures, it was about changing the fundamental culture of law enforcement. Community trust, once shattered, began to rebuild. The department instituted regular open forums where citizens could voice concerns directly to officers. Body camera footage was made readily available to the public. Training programs were redesigned with input from civil rights organizations and community leaders. But perhaps the most significant change was in the daily interactions between officers and citizens. The tension that had once characterized these encounters began to ease. Officers learned to approach situations with curiosity rather than suspicion, to communicate rather than command. Miguel's role had evolved as well. What had started as a standard corruption investigation had become a model for institutional reform. He was now regularly consulted by departments across the country, helping them implement similar changes before they reached crisis points. The small town that had once represented everything wrong with American law enforcement had become an example of what it could be. Crime rates hadn't risen, as some had feared. Instead, community cooperation had made law enforcement more effective, not less. "Real change," Miguel often said in his presentations, "doesn't come from top-down mandates. It comes from moments of truth when we're forced to see ourselves clearly and brave enough to admit we need to change." The security camera footage that had once sparked outrage had been repurposed. It now played a different role, as a training tool, showing future officers how quickly bias can override judgment, and how maintaining professional dignity in the face of prejudice can become a catalyst for transformation. 1 year after the incident, the department held a ceremony. The old badge design, which had represented authority and power, was replaced with a new one that emphasized service and community. As officers lined up to receive their new badges, there was a sense that this wasn't just symbolic, it was a genuine transformation. The story had come full circle. What began with handcuffs and an interrogation room had ended with handshakes and cooperation. It proved that even the deepest wounds could heal when truth, accountability, and the willingness to change came together. Part 5. When Legacy Endures. 5 years after Miguel Santos walked into that small-town police station, the impact of what became known as the Santos Incident continued to reshape law enforcement across America. What started as a single moment of prejudice had sparked a revolution in police culture, training, and community relations. The changes that began in that small town had grown into a national movement, proving that transformation was possible even in the most entrenched systems. The original police station, now a training center for law enforcement reform, stood as a symbol of both failure and redemption. Its halls, once filled with whispered suspicions and unspoken biases, now echoed with discussions of community engagement and cultural understanding. The interrogation room where Miguel had sat in handcuffs had been converted into a classroom where officers learned about implicit bias and the importance of questioning their assumptions. Karen Blake, who had once embodied the old guard's resistance to change, had become one of the most powerful voices for reform. Her transformation from antagonist to advocate resonated deeply with veteran officers struggling to adapt to new expectations. "My greatest mistake became my greatest teacher," she would often say during her nationwide speaking tours. It's never too late to unlearn prejudice and relearn justice. The town itself had been transformed. Crime rates had dropped significantly, not through aggressive enforcement, but through community partnership and prevention. The curriculum he developed, combining practical law enforcement techniques with cultural competency and bias awareness, had been adopted by police academies across the country. What happened that day wasn't just about one officer's prejudice or one department's culture, he would explain to his students. It was about the possibility of transformation that exists within every challenge we face. Academic studies of the incident and its aftermath became required reading in criminal justice programs. Researchers noted how the combination of clear evidence, decisive action, and committed leadership had created a perfect storm for positive change. The security footage of Miguel's arrest, once a source of shame, was now used as a teaching tool, showing how quickly assumption and bias could override training and reason. The ripple effects extended beyond law enforcement. Local governments nationwide began examining their own institutions for similar patterns of bias and discrimination. Schools incorporated lessons about civil rights and community responsibility into their curricula. Businesses implemented new training programs, and community organizations developed initiatives to bridge racial and cultural divides. Perhaps most significantly, the incident had changed the conversation about police reform. Instead of the usual cycle of scandal, outrage, and forgotten promises, the Santos case offered a roadmap for genuine transformation. It showed that change wasn't just about new policies or procedures. It was about creating a culture of accountability, transparency, and mutual respect. Former Captain Howard, though retired, remained active in police reform efforts. His perspective as a leader who had initially failed to recognize problems within his department, but then worked to correct them, provided valuable insights for other law enforcement executives facing similar challenges. "The hardest part of leadership," he often noted, "is admitting when the system you've defended your entire career needs to change." The small-town success story had become a beacon of hope in ongoing national discussions about police reform and racial justice. Visitors from across the country came to study their methods, observe their training programs, and learn from their experience. The transformation wasn't perfect. There were still challenges to overcome and improvements to be made, but the progress was undeniable. As Miguel Santos sat in his office in Washington, D.C., reviewing reports from departments implementing similar reforms, he reflected on how a single moment of injustice had catalyzed such widespread change. The framed photograph on his wall showed him standing with a group of graduating cadets from the Reformed Police Academy, their faces reflecting the diversity of the community they would serve. Below it, a simple quote reminded him daily of the power of transformative justice. "Sometimes the greatest act of law enforcement is enforcing change within ourselves." The legacy of what happened in that small-town police station continued to grow, a testament to the idea that even the most deeply rooted problems could be addressed when confronted with courage, commitment, and compassion. It proved that true justice isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about evolving our understanding of what justice really means. Part 6. When Tomorrow Changes Today. 10 years after the Santos incident, a new generation of police officers gathered in the auditorium of the National Law Enforcement Training Center. The keynote speakers were an unlikely pair. Miguel Santos, now director of the FBI's Division of Civil Rights and Police Reform, and Karen Blake, the former officer whose mistake had sparked a national movement. Their annual joint presentation had become legendary in law enforcement circles, not just for its content but for what it represented: the possibility of profound change. "A decade ago, I put handcuffs on a man because of my own unexamined biases," Karen began, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "Today, I want to talk about the handcuffs we don't see, the ones in our minds that lock us into old ways of thinking." The audience, comprising officers from across the country, listened intently. Many had their own stories of transformation, inspired by the changes that began in that small town. Miguel stepped forward, his presence as calm and measured as it had been that fateful day. "The question I'm most often asked," he said, "is whether I knew what would happen when I walked into that police station. The truth is, I couldn't have predicted the outcome, but I knew that change only happens when we're willing to face uncomfortable truths." The transformation that began in one small town had evolved into a comprehensive model for police reform nationwide. Training academies now emphasized emotional intelligence alongside tactical skills. Departments that adopted the reforms saw significant improvements in community relations, reduced instances of excessive force, and better outcomes in crisis situations. More importantly, they reported higher job satisfaction among officers and increased trust from the communities they served. The old police station where it all began had been designated a historic site, not just for what happened there, but for what it represented, the moment when law enforcement began to truly examine itself. The interrogation room where Miguel had sat in handcuffs was now a museum piece, preserved as a reminder of how far they'd come and how easily progress could be reversed without constant vigilance. The hardest part of change, Karen often reflected, isn't making it happen, it's making it last. Her words resonated with departments across the country struggling to maintain momentum in their reform efforts. The solution, they discovered, wasn't in grand gestures or sweeping policies, but in the daily commitment to doing things differently. Miguel's work continued to evolve. His focus shifted from investigating departments to helping them transform proactively. "Prevention is always better than intervention," he would say. "The best changes happen when departments choose to evolve, not when they're forced to." The small town that started it all had become a model of community policing. Officers regularly attended neighborhood events, knew residents by name, and worked alongside community leaders to address problems before they escalated. Young people who once viewed police with suspicion now considered law enforcement a viable career path. As Miguel and Karen concluded their presentation, they shared a look that spoke volumes about their shared journey. From adversaries to allies, their story embodied the very transformation they sought to inspire. Change, Miguel told the audience, is not just about policies or procedures. It's about people willing to learn from their mistakes and help others do the same. The legacy of the Santos incident continued to grow, not as a cautionary tale of what went wrong, but as an inspiring example of how to make things right. It proved that even the most deeply rooted problems could be addressed with courage, compassion, and commitment to change. As the new generation of officers filed out of the auditorium, they carried with them not just lessons about policing, but about human nature itself. They understood that true justice begins with self-reflection, that authority comes from respect rather than force, and that the greatest power lies not in maintaining control, but in having the courage to change. Part 7. When History Teaches Forward. 20 years had passed since the Santos incident, and its ripples continued to shape the landscape of American law enforcement. On a crisp autumn morning, Miguel Santos stood before a packed auditorium at Harvard Law School, delivering what he had announced would be his final public lecture before retirement. The audience included police chiefs, civil rights attorneys, lawmakers, and a new generation of reformers who had grown up studying his case. "Change," Miguel began, his hair now silver but his presence still commanding, "is not a destination. It's a continuous journey that each generation must undertake anew." He gestured to the massive screen behind him, where the infamous security footage played silently, a moment frozen in time that had unfrozen countless minds. In the front row sat Karen Blake, now a distinguished professor of police ethics and reform at a prestigious university. Their unlikely friendship had become a powerful symbol of transformation, studied in psychology classes as much as in police academies. Together, they had written books, developed training programs, and most importantly, shown that the human capacity for growth knows no bounds. The small town where it all began had become more than just a success story. It was now a living laboratory of continuous innovation in community policing. The police department, once a symbol of institutional bias, had evolved into an internationally recognized center of excellence. Officers from around the world came to study their methods, not just of law enforcement, but of community building. The greatest lesson, Miguel continued, wasn't about police reform at all. It was about human nature, our capacity to both resist and embrace change, our ability to transform crisis into opportunity, and our power to choose growth over comfort. The audience leaned forward, many taking notes, others nodding in recognition of truths they had discovered in their own work. The Santos method, as it had come to be known, had expanded far beyond law enforcement. Corporate leaders used it to address workplace discrimination. Schools incorporated its principles into anti-bullying programs. Government agencies applied its lessons to public service reform. Departments that had fully embraced the reforms showed not just improved community relations and reduced incidents of bias, but better mental health outcomes for officers, increased job satisfaction, and higher rates of successful conflict resolution. Karen stood to join Miguel at the podium, their annual role reversal now a treasured tradition. 20 years ago, she began, I represented everything wrong with the system. Today, I represent the possibility of transformation. But the real story isn't about Miguel or me. It's about all of you and the choices you make every day. The audience included children and grandchildren of officers who had served in that small-town department during the incident. Many had followed their parents into law enforcement, but with a fundamentally different understanding of what it meant to serve and protect. They were the living legacy of a transformation that had begun with a single moment of injustice turned into opportunity. Miguel's retirement plans included establishing a foundation dedicated to supporting innovative approaches to community justice. The first grant had already been awarded to a program developing virtual reality experiences that allowed officers to experience situations from multiple perspectives, a technological evolution of the empathy-based training he had pioneered. The future of justice, Miguel concluded, lies not in our ability to enforce laws, but in our willingness to enforce change within ourselves. Every generation faces its own challenges, its own biases to overcome, its own transformations to embrace. The question is not whether change is necessary, but whether we have the courage to be part of it. As the standing ovation filled the hall, Miguel and Karen shared a knowing look. The handcuffs that had once bound them in conflict now bound them in purpose. Their story had become part of a larger narrative about human potential and the endless possibility of positive change. The Santos incident had long since transcended its origins as a cautionary tale about police bias. It had become a blueprint for transformative justice, a testament to the power of individual choice, and a reminder that the most profound changes often begin with a single moment of truth. As Miguel looked out over the audience one last time, he saw not just faces but futures, countless possibilities for continued transformation and growth. The journey that began with his arrest had no true ending, only new beginnings in the hearts and minds of each person who chose to learn from it. Part 8. When stories shape society. The Santos incident had transcended its origins to become deeply woven into the fabric of American culture. 25 years after that fateful day, documentaries, books, and academic studies continued to explore its significance. But perhaps most telling was how the story had become a cultural touchstone, referenced in everything from popular entertainment to political discourse. Hollywood had made multiple attempts to capture the story on screen, but none quite matched the raw power of the original security footage that had sparked a nation's conscience. The most successful adaptation wasn't a police drama at all, but rather a nuanced character study that focused on the human capacity for change. The film earned critical acclaim for avoiding sensationalism in favor of exploring the subtle psychological transformations that had made the real story so compelling. In university classrooms across the country, the Santos case, as it was now known in academic circles, was studied not just in criminal justice programs, but in sociology, psychology, and even business schools. Management courses used it to discuss organizational change. Psychology departments analyzed it as a case study in bias recognition and personal transformation. Sociology programs explored it as a model of institutional reform. The phrase, Santos moment had entered the lexicon, referring to any instance where a failure becomes a catalyst for positive change. Corporate leaders spoke of their company's Santos moments. Educational reformers used the term to describe breakthrough realizations about systemic problems. It had become shorthand for the kind of transformative self-awareness that leads to meaningful reform. Miguel Santos himself had become an almost mythical figure, though he consistently deflected such characterizations. "The power of this story," he would often say, "lies not in what I did, but in what everyone else chose to do with that moment." His commitment to keeping the focus on systemic change rather than personal glory had only enhanced his legend. Karen Blake's journey had become equally emblematic. Her transformation from antagonist to advocate was studied as a model of personal growth and redemption. Behavioral psychologists analyzed her case to better understand how deeply held beliefs could be challenged and changed. What could have been a mark of shame had become a source of pride in their ability to change. Local tours included stops at significant locations from the incident, but focused on the transformation that followed rather than the event itself. The town had become a living museum of positive change. Popular culture continued to reference the incident in unexpected ways. Television shows incorporated elements of the story into their plots. Musicians wrote songs about transformation and justice that alluded to the case. Artists created works that explored its themes. The story had become part of the cultural consciousness, a modern parable about justice, prejudice, and the possibility of change. Social media regularly surfaced the original viral video, not as a reminder of injustice, but as inspiration for new generations facing their own challenges. Younger activists studied the case for insights into creating systemic change. The hashtag #Santos moment continued to trend whenever institutions faced their own reckonings with prejudice and power. The academic world had produced countless papers and studies analyzing every aspect of the incident and its aftermath. The most influential research focused not on the event itself, but on the unique conditions that had allowed positive change to take root and flourish. These studies helped other institutions create environments conducive to meaningful reform. More than the specific reforms it had inspired, the lasting impact of the Santos incident was in how it had changed the way society talked about institutional change. It had provided a vocabulary and framework for discussing difficult transformations. It had shown that change, while challenging, was possible when approached with honesty, courage, and commitment. As new challenges emerged and new generations faced their own struggles with justice and equity, the lessons of the Santos incident continued to resonate. It remained a reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes begin not with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but with simple moments of truth that echo through time, shaping the future in ways their originators could never have imagined. Part 9. When Tomorrow Builds on Yesterday. 30 years after the Santos incident, on a bright spring morning, a young police cadet named Maya Chen stood before a holographic projection of the famous security footage in the National Civil Rights Museum's Law Enforcement Reform Wing. The granddaughter of immigrants, like Miguel Santos had been, she represented a new generation of law enforcement officers who had grown up in a world shaped by his legacy. Maya was part of the first class of cadets to experience the new immersive empathy training program, developed using advanced virtual reality technology, and based on the principles Miguel Santos and Karen Blake had established decades earlier. The program allowed officers to experience historical incidents of bias and misconduct from multiple perspectives, creating deep emotional understanding that traditional training could never achieve. The Santos incident had evolved from a historical event into a living laboratory of ongoing innovation. The original police station, now the International Center for Justice Innovation, housed research teams developing new approaches to community safety and social harmony. Scientists worked alongside reformed officers, community leaders, and social workers to create increasingly sophisticated models of preventive justice. Karen Blake's final book, published posthumously, had become a cornerstone text in police academies worldwide. Titled, "The Courage to Change, From Bias to Bridge Building," it offered a deeply personal account of her transformation while providing practical guidance for institutional reform. Her vulnerability in examining her own journey continued to touch hearts and open minds. Miguel Santos, now in his 80s but still sharp as ever, had taken on a new role as the head of the Global Initiative for Transformative Justice, an organization dedicated to applying the lessons learned from his case to emerging challenges around the world. His focus had shifted from reforming existing systems to reimagining what justice could mean in an increasingly connected global society. The Santos Principles, as they had come to be known, had been adapted for use in fields far beyond law enforcement. Artificial intelligence developers used them to check for algorithmic bias. Corporate leaders applied them to workplace culture. Educational institutions incorporated them into their approach to discipline and conflict resolution. The core ideas about human dignity, systemic change, and the power of transformative moments proved universally applicable. Virtual reality reconstructions of the incident were now used not just for police training, but in schools, corporations, and government agencies around the world. Studies showed that departments that had fully embraced the Santos method had not only maintained their initial improvements, but had continued to evolve and innovate. More importantly, they had created cultures where officers felt empowered to question their own assumptions and support each other's growth. The small town itself had become a case study in sustained transformation. Third-generation officers now patrolled streets where their grandparents had once demonstrated against police bias. Community police partnerships had evolved into deep collaborations that addressed root causes of social issues before they became law enforcement problems. The town's model of preventive justice had become a blueprint for communities worldwide. As Maya finished her training session, she reflected on how a single moment of injustice, handled with wisdom and courage, had created ripples that continued to shape her world. The challenges of her generation were different from those Miguel Santos had faced, but the principles he had illuminated remained relevant. The importance of questioning assumptions, the power of transformative moments, and the endless human capacity for positive change. The legacy of the Santos incident continued to evolve, not as a static historical event, but as a living inspiration for each new generation facing its own challenges. It remained a testament to the idea that the most powerful changes often begin with simple moments of truth, and that the courage to face those moments honestly can transform not just individuals or institutions, but the very way we understand justice and human potential. Part 10. When Time Comes Full Circle. In the year 2054, on the 40th anniversary of the Santos incident, a remarkable gathering took place at the site of the original police station. Present were 4 generations of people whose lives had been touched by that pivotal moment. The children and grandchildren of Miguel Santos and Karen Blake, officers from the original department, community members who had witnessed the transformation, and a new generation of justice advocates carrying the torch forward. Miguel Santos, at 92, made his final public appearance. Though his body had aged, his eyes still carried that same quiet intensity that had marked his moment of peaceful resistance 4 decades earlier. He sat in a hover chair at the center of the gathering, surrounded by the living legacy of his work, a world where law enforcement had evolved beyond its traditional boundaries into something more nuanced, more human. The ceremony began with a holographic recreation of the incident, but this time, it showed more than just the security footage that had gone viral. Using advanced emotional mapping technology, it allowed participants to experience the thoughts and feelings of everyone involved. The fear, the prejudice, the determination, and ultimately, the transformation. It was a powerful reminder that every moment of conflict carries within it the seeds of profound change. Karen Blake's great-granddaughter, now a leading researcher in neurological bias prevention, presented the latest findings from the Global Justice Initiative. Their work had expanded beyond traditional law enforcement to address emerging challenges: digital rights, environmental justice, and interplanetary law enforcement as humanity reached for the stars. The principles that had emerged from that small-town confrontation had proven adaptable to every new frontier. The small town itself had become unrecognizable, yet somehow truer to its essential nature than ever before. The police station had evolved into a community harmony center, where law enforcement was just one part of a holistic approach to social well-being. Officers worked alongside mental health professionals, community advocates, and AI ethics advisors, creating a model of public safety that emphasized prevention and understanding over reaction and force. Maya Chen, the cadet we met earlier, now stood as the Chief of Transformative Justice for the United Nations. Her career had been shaped by the Santos legacy, and she had taken its principles to a global stage. Under her leadership, the concept of justice had evolved to encompass not just punishment and reform, but healing and growth for all parties involved. As the ceremony progressed, stories were shared not just through words, but through neural networks that allowed participants to share memories and emotions directly. The collective experience highlighted a profound truth. The Santos incident had never really been about one agent, one officer, or one department. It had been about humanity's eternal struggle to overcome its limitations and reach for something higher. The technological advances of 2054 had made it possible to measure the ripple effects of that single moment with unprecedented precision. His voice, though softened by age, still carried the weight of wisdom earned through decades of dedication to positive change. "The greatest power we possess," he said, "is not the power to enforce, but the power to transform. Every moment of conflict is an invitation to evolution. Every challenge is an opportunity for growth." As he spoke, quantum sensors recorded the emotional resonance of his words rippling through the gathered crowd, creating patterns that would be studied by future generations. The metrics showed what everyone present could feel, the profound truth that when one person stands firm in their dignity and another finds the courage to change, the entire universe shifts ever so slightly toward justice. The ceremony concluded with a gesture that bridged past and future, the dedication of the first Interplanetary Justice Academy, based entirely on the principles that had emerged from that small-town confrontation 40 years earlier. As humanity reached for the stars, the lessons learned on Earth about prejudice, power, and transformation would help shape the future of human civilization beyond our planet. The Santos incident had become more than history. It was now part of humanity's evolutionary story. It stood as eternal proof that in our darkest moments lie the seeds of our greatest transformations, and that the journey toward justice is not a destination, but an endless spiral of growth and understanding, reaching ever upward toward the light of our highest potential. Part 11. When Humanity Reflects. In the quantum archives of human evolution, established in 2060, the Santos incident occupied a unique place in the collective consciousness of humanity. More than just a historical event, it had become a philosophical touchstone, a reference point for understanding the very nature of human transformation. As society grappled with increasingly complex challenges, the lessons drawn from that moment continued to provide guidance and inspiration. The emergence of artificial consciousness had brought new relevance to the principles that emerged from the Santos case. As humanity debated the rights and responsibilities of synthetic beings, the fundamental questions of bias, prejudice, and institutional transformation found new application. The Santos Protocol became a key framework for ensuring that AI systems were developed with built-in capacity for self-examination and ethical evolution. Sociologists studying the Great Transformation of the mid-21st century identified the Santos incident as a crucial turning point in human social evolution. It represented the moment when society began to truly understand that change wasn't just about updating policies or implementing new procedures. It was about fundamentally reimagining the relationship between power, justice, and human dignity. The Global Mind Initiative, a revolutionary project combining advanced neurological research with social psychology, used the Santos case as a primary model for understanding how individual transformation could catalyze systemic change. Their research revealed that when people deeply engaged with the story, it activated neural pathways associated with empathy, moral reasoning, and transformative learning. In the virtual reality spaces where much of human interaction now took place, the Santos simulation became a rite of passage for those seeking positions of authority in any field. Participants experienced the incident from multiple perspectives, not just as historical recreation, but as a deep psychological examination of their own capacity for both bias and transformation. Climate crisis negotiations found unexpected guidance in the Santos Principles. The emphasis on acknowledging systemic problems while maintaining focus on constructive change proved valuable in addressing global environmental challenges. Nations and corporations that had long resisted accountability began to see the value in transformative transparency. The discovery of microbial life on Europa, one of Jupiter's moons, prompted scientists and philosophers to revisit the Santos case for insights into how humanity might approach contact with truly alien life forms. The lessons about overcoming ingrained prejudices and questioning fundamental assumptions proved remarkably applicable to humanity's preparation for potential extraterrestrial encounters. Memory architects, working with advanced cognitive mapping technology, studied the unique properties of how the Santos story was stored and transmitted in human consciousness. They discovered that it existed not just as a historical record, but as a kind of psychological template for transformation, accessible across cultural and linguistic boundaries. The Orbital Academy of Peace, humanity's first space-based educational institution, made the Santos Principles central to its curriculum. This pattern recognition helped society better understand and navigate similar transformative opportunities as they arose. In meditation centers and consciousness expansion facilities around the world, the Santos incident was used as a focusing point for developing what became known as transformative awareness, the capacity to recognize and catalyze moments of potential change. Practitioners learned to identify similar opportunities in their own lives and communities. As humanity stood on the brink of even greater technological and social transformations, the Santos case remained a constant reminder that the most profound changes often began with simple moments of human dignity meeting institutional power. It demonstrated that the capacity for transformation was not just an individual trait, but a fundamental property of human consciousness itself. The story had transcended its original context to become a kind of universal parable about the human capacity for growth and change. It reminded each generation that the path to justice was not a straight line, but a spiral, each turn bringing new understanding and new challenges, each moment containing the potential for transformation. In the end, the most profound legacy of the Santos incident was not the specific reforms it inspired or the institutions it transformed, but the way it permanently altered humanity's understanding of its own potential for change. It stood as eternal proof that in every moment of conflict lies the seed of transformation, waiting only for the courage to nurture it into being. Part 12. When Time Meets Eternity. As we reach the end of this journey through time and transformation, we find ourselves back at the beginning, yet forever changed by the path we've traveled. The Santos incident, which began as a single moment in a small-town police station, has become a testament to humanity's infinite capacity for growth and change. In the year 2075, 50 years after that fateful day, the last recording of Miguel Santos was finally released to the public. Made shortly before his passing at the age of 93, it contained a message that would resonate across generations. The greatest power we possess is not the ability to change others, but the courage to allow ourselves to be changed by truth. The holographic time capsule, preserved in the global archives of human evolution, showed an elderly Santos, his face lined with wisdom, his eyes still bright with purpose. "I've been asked countless times if I knew what would happen that day," he said, "if I had planned for it to become what it became. The truth is simpler and more profound. I simply chose to stand in my truth, with dignity and without hatred." The rest was humanity choosing to grow. The impact of his words, enhanced by quantum emotional resonance technology, allowed future generations to feel not just the meaning, but the deep truth behind them. It was a reminder that transformation doesn't require grand strategies or elaborate plans. It requires only the courage to face truth with an open heart. Karen Blake's final message, recorded years earlier, played alongside Santos's. "We think transformation is about changing who we are, but it's really about becoming who we truly are. Every act of prejudice is a forgotten truth about our shared humanity. Every act of justice is remembering. Their intertwined legacies had become more than historical fact. They had become part of humanity's emotional DNA, a story written not just in books and databases, but in the very way humans understood their capacity for change. The small town where it all began had become a pilgrimage site, not just for those studying law enforcement, but for anyone seeking to understand the alchemy of human transformation. As humanity expanded into the solar system, establishing colonies on Mars and the moons of Jupiter, they carried with them not just the technical lessons of the Santos Protocol, but its spiritual essence, the understanding that justice is not a destination, but a continuous journey of growth and understanding. The Quantum Consciousness Network, linking minds across the solar system, used the emotional signature of the Santos incident as a calibration point for measuring transformative potential in human interaction. Scientists discovered that the pattern of change it represented was not just social or psychological, but reflected fundamental patterns in the universe itself, the way systems transform, the way consciousness evolves, the way truth emerges from complexity. In schools across Earth and beyond, children learned not just about what happened, but were guided to understand the timeless principles it revealed, that every moment of conflict contains the seed of transformation, that dignity is more powerful than force, that true change begins with the courage to see ourselves clearly. Their work showed that the same patterns of resistance, recognition, and renewal played out at every level of human experience, from personal relationships to interplanetary diplomacy. As artificial intelligence evolved into true synthetic consciousness, the Santos principles provided a framework for understanding how systems, whether human, mechanical, or hybrid, could develop the capacity for self-reflection and positive change. The pattern of transformation first documented in that small-town police station proved to be a universal template for evolutionary growth. Yet perhaps the most profound legacy of the Santos incident was not in its grand applications, but in its intimate truth. That in every moment, each of us faces the choice between fear and understanding, between resistance and growth, between holding on to who we think we are and becoming who we truly can be. As we close this chronicle of transformation, we're reminded that the story never truly ends. It lives on in every moment of choice, every act of courage, every instance where someone chooses truth over comfort, growth over certainty, love over fear. The flame that was lit in that small-town police station continues to illuminate the path forward, not just for law enforcement or institutions, but for humanity itself. For in the end, the Santos incident was never just about police reform or social justice or institutional change. It was and remains a mirror in which we can see our own capacity for transformation, a reminder that the greatest changes often begin in the smallest moments, and that the power to transform our world lies not in force or authority, but in the courage to stand in our truth and the wisdom to grow from what it reveals.